Hello, my name is Swati Jain.
And my name is Daeyun Kim.
We are going to talk about OASE, which is an international peer reviewed journal for architecture that brings together academic research and sensibilities of design practice.
OASE 97, one of the many issues of the journal, describes and illustrates passionate debates and polemical interactions from the 17th to the late 20th century. Creating and thinking about architecture has always been defined by the mechanism of action and reaction. One way of making architecture is by criticizing or rejecting and immediately using that as a starting point for another opposing practice or theory.
I think architects and critics react to each other's views using drawings, text, models, and buildings all the time. A good architecture culture thrives on such bases, the exciting battle between views, opinions, and belief of people and cities.
So we are going to talk about 10 such examples of action and reaction from the past centuries.
Bernini, Borromini, or the Zhang's face of Roman Baroque. The rivalry between 17th century architects Bernini and Borromini is legendary. Anecdotes have helped historians to turn Baroque Rome into a play of personalities and to identify Borromini with an alternative to the palpable and solemn city that is traditionally identified with Bernini. In a certain sense, these poles crystallize along the legacy of Michelangelo. But the opposition also shapes the self images that 20th century architects can dispose of.
The Monument and the Field, Nicholas Habsburg's church in Georgian London. Although it is impossible to prove that Nicholas Habsburg built his churches in 17th century London as a reaction to the generic city developments at that time, Pierre Victoria Aureli retraces their origin as clear and distinct reaction to the mediocre urban fabric of the city, opposed both by their formal and material monumentality to the grey brick terraced housing blocks that are directed towards economy and profit. Habsburg's churches, in their boldness and contrast to their surroundings, anticipate the contemporary urban landmarks that symbolize many European cities today.
Lagier and Viel de Saint Marc. The sacred and the profane in two architectural origin myths. While the origins of architecture have been the subject of numerous writings, two important figures came to the forefront in the 18th century: Marc Antonio Lagier and Jean-Louis Viel de Saint. Richard Whitman compares the two, attempting a new discursive framework for architectural thinking. Both Lagier and Viel de Saint departed from Vitruvius's account of architecture as a mankind's observation of nature. But as Whitman underlines, Viel de Saint inverted Lagier's understanding of architecture. For Viel de Saint, the origins of architecture lay no longer in a utilitarian mode of imitation, but in mankind's quest to relate his life to that of the cosmos.
Joseph Frank, Siam, and the Assault on the Unified Ideal. Viennese architect Joseph Frank maintained a very charged relation with the Siam. As one of the participants to the initial meeting of La Saraz in 1928, Frank opposed Siam's dream to construct a pure, unified, and systemized vision of modernism. Christopher Long argues that this critique would become decisive for Frank's alternative definition of modern architecture that critically distanced itself from the pathos, a new romanticism of form and machine, that was characteristic of architecture and design in the 1920s.
Truth and Disguises, Philip Johnson and the Non-Miesian Directions. The oeuvre of Philip Johnson can be described, says Robert Gargiani, as a reaction to the work of Mies van der Rohe. Mies turned structural elements into symbolic icons of a new architectural order. The connection between these elements are at the base of Johnson's artistic identity. He discovered a new repertory of forms by developing plastic variations of concrete and by inventing a non-Miesian plasticity. Instead of making copies of Mies's buildings, Johnson ended up assigning a pop aura to elements from the oeuvre of his perceptor.
Composition versus discomposition, Palladio Eisenman and the quest for instability. The work of Peter Eisenman is developed for an important part in reaction to that of Andrea Palladio. Eisenman employs this continuous interaction to question the classical idea of form and to redefine it as an unstable field of possibilities. In addition, Stefano Corbo argues the interplay of forces between the architects cannot be isolated as such. Other interpreters of Palladio, such as Rudolf Whitcore and Colin Roy, also play a role. The work of the Renaissance architect offers Eisenman a means to come to terms with these father figures.
Aesthetics between provocation and production. Counter projects. In Brussels, of the mid 1970s, counter projects produced by students of La Cambre became a tool of resistance that resonated with the activism of the Atelier, ARAU, and AAM. These drawing manifestos simultaneously criticized existing projects for urban development and offered alternatives. They functioned as testing grounds for aesthetic articulation as much as for political provocation.
Living in Liberty after 1968, Charles Bandehoff versus Lucien Kroll. Not only did Belgian architects Bandehoff and Kroll study together from 1951 onwards, they also worked together for a while. Afterwards, they each developed their own and totally opposite over. In the case of Bandehoff based on a search for autonomy, in Kroll's case based on participation. By means of student housing project they both realized after 1968, Christopher van Gerwey reconstructs the position of Kroll and Bandehoff, positions that are exemplary for the evolution of 20th century architecture and for the relation between the architect and his audience.
Criticism from Within, Kenneth Frampton and the Retreat from Postmodernism. The Presence of the Past, the first international architecture exhibition of the Venice Biennale in 1980, was characterized by an opposition within the curatorial team. The advisory committee preparing the Biennale content included Paolo Porteghese, Charles Jenkins, Robert Stern, Christina Squires, Vincent Scully, and Kenneth Frampton. The latter reassigned from the committee only a few months after the initial meetings out of the critique with the intention of the other curators, namely the postmodernism celebrated by the presence of the past. Exactly this opposition towards the Biennale curatorial team would lead Frampton to develop his version of critical regionalism. Frampton's retreat from the Biennale marked his engagement with architecture after modernism and enabled him to open a path distinct to postmodernism. I think that this coupled relationship between action and reaction is redundant now. Social questions have been disappearing in 20th century due to advanced technology like printing and internet. Most importantly, internet taking over this old model.
So, I totally agree. I think we should invest more time in exploring new models of action and reaction of today's age. Although the traditional pairs of action and reaction are now exposed to everyone to interpret or reinterpret. So far, the fuller opinion of everyone starts to yield new meaning to the way we make, live and experience architecture as a whole.
I think I have a perfect example to cite. The Helsinki competition received more than 1,700 diverse projects, but there is no deep discourse on any of these projects. It's highly globalized, individualized, and atomized on several levels of execution. The excessive matter that is being published online needs to be curated well. It could be through blogs, public quotes, or online forums. I noticed that one of the attempts of systemizing the novel idea from the competition was to categorize the 1,700 entries into the tags of material, shape, and the sizes of each of those projects, which lets people access this data more accurately. According to me, the new model should explore more such ways of curating and making ideas instrumental in people's everyday lives.
I think you're right. The democratizing architecture to everyone, including social sciences, arts, crafts, etc., and promoting cross pollination of these fields helps set a new ground for argument, which could be a gestation ground to every architectural event that happens in and around the world. So one of the way of doing this is by opening or competition design entries for public voting and taking their opinions into the consideration.
Yeah, I think public voting is a really good option. Because architecture involves people at every level. Seeking public opinion is healthy for everyone that's involved. But at the end of the day, the public opinion should be an additional factor that is used to make the best and informed decision. Like that shouldn't be the only factor,
Yeah.
but one of the main factors of a competition winning one of the entries.
Yeah, I think so too. Personally, absolute adherence to public opinion should not be mandatory for the architect.
Yeah.
And if I'm designing a building for public use, I would consider it very valuable to have an assessment of the buildings and for the future occupants' opinions.
Social networking sites such as Instagram, Pinterest, or websites such as ArcDaily and the Jain, etc., can be new forms for action and for the action and reaction.